So our first speaker is a New Testament historian who has a Master of Arts degree in Religious Studies from Liberty University and is now a PhD candidate in New Testament Studies at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. He is a member of the Society of Biblical Literature and of the Evangelical Philosophical Society. He is the author of 3 books, the most recent being The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. One of the most esteemed persons in this field of inquiry is a man by the name of Gary Habermas. Professor Habermas remarks that, in my opinion, Mike Licona's knowledge of the case for Jesus' resurrection places him among an elite number of evangelicals who are writing on this subject today. Our speaker lives in Virginia Beach with his wife Debbie and 2 children, and he has a website that you can learn more about, simply called risenjesus.com. So please join me in welcoming to this podium Mike Licona.
The question before us is, did Jesus rise from the dead? And for me, this is one of the most interesting as well as important topics for discussion. Let me explain why. About 20 years ago, I went through a period of intense questioning of my faith. I was in graduate school at the time, specializing in the study of New Testament Greek and planning on going into the ministry. But at that time, I began asking the tough question, how can I know if Christianity is true? I believed I had an intimate relationship with God at that time, but I started to wonder, is this really the case, or was I really just self-deluded? So I took a step back from my position of confidence and began to look at Christianity as well as the evidence for many of the major world religions. I also considered the arguments for atheism. And after several years, I came to the conclusion that what I had originally believed had been revealed to me by God's Spirit had now been manifested, or I should say confirmed by history, science, and philosophy. Namely, that God exists and that He has actually revealed Himself to mankind in Jesus Christ, and that Christianity is true. The case for the resurrection of Jesus was especially influential in my decision. Now, the reason Jesus' resurrection is so important is because the truth of Christianity hinges on it. Jesus' atoning death and subsequent resurrection have been bedrock doctrines of Christianity since its beginning. If they didn't occur, the foundation collapses and Christianity is false. The Apostle Paul himself wrote, "If Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless." On the other hand, if Jesus was actually resurrected, then it seems there's good reason for believing that Christianity is true. Given this, I think we have a problem if we say, well, my worldview just doesn't allow that. Well, if that's the position you find yourself in, it may be time to change your worldview. Let's look now at 3 facts that are strongly supported and acknowledged by an impressive majority of today's scholars. Fact number 1, Jesus' death by crucifixion. Nearly 100% of all scholars agree with this conclusion. Let me provide 4 reasons why we can be confident of this. First, Jesus' death by crucifixion is multiply attested by both Christian and non-Christian sources. Second, the chances of surviving crucifixion, even under the best of conditions, were bleak. Crucifixion and the torture that usually preceded it was an unspeakably cruel process and may have been the worst way to die in antiquity. Third, we can understand that while some debate remains among medical experts regarding the actual cause of death by crucifixion, they are nearly a single voice in saying that Jesus most certainly died from being crucified. The majority opinion is that He died by asphyxiation, and our understanding of crucifixion supports that conclusion. As the 19th century liberal scholar David Strauss noted, even if Jesus had somehow survived crucifixion, He couldn't have convinced His disciples that He had been resurrected in new life. Imagine Jesus half dead in the tomb, and so He wakes up in the dark and He wants to get out. So He takes His hands that had been pierced by nails, places them on an extremely heavy stone, and pushes it out of the way. And then He's met by the guards who say, "Where do you think you're going, pal?" And He says, "I'm out of here, guys." Then He beats them up. And then He walks blocks, if not miles, on pierced and wounded feet in order to find His disciples. Finally, He finds where they're at. Peter opens the door and sees Jesus hunched over in His pathetic and mutilated state and says, "Wow, I can't wait to have a resurrection body like yours." No, he would have said, "Let's get you a doctor, you need help." As Strauss went on to say, there's no way that Jesus in his state could have convinced His disciples that He was the risen Lord of life. Alive? Barely. Risen? No way. Fact number 2, the empty tomb. That Jesus' tomb was empty is agreed on by an impressive 75% of all scholars writing on the subject. Let me give you 3 arguments for the empty tomb. First, the Jerusalem factor. Now, Jesus was publicly executed, buried, and then his resurrection was first proclaimed in Jerusalem. It would have been impossible for Christianity to get off the ground if the body had still been in the tomb. All the Roman or Jewish authorities would have had to do is go to the tomb, exhume the body, tie his ankles together, drag him through Main Street in Jerusalem, and the hoax was over. But there's no evidence whatsoever that that occurred. Second, Jesus' enemies attest to the empty tomb. Justin and Tertullian report that members of the Jewish leadership were claiming that the disciples of Jesus had stolen his body. This is outside corroboration of Matthew 28:13 and seems to be an attempt to account for a missing body. If my 10-year-old son went in and told his 4th grade teacher that the dog ate his homework, well, that would be implying that he didn't have it to turn in. And likewise, you wouldn't claim that the body was stolen if it was still in the tomb. Paul Meyer, distinguished professor of ancient history at Western Michigan University, writes, Jewish polemics shared with Christians the conviction that the sepulchre was empty, but gave natural explanations for it. And such positive evidence within a hostile source is the strongest kind of evidence and becomes self-authenticating. Third, the concept of resurrection up until and even past the time of Jesus was that it was a bodily event. The eminent New Testament historian N.T. Wright has demonstrated this carefully in his new 800-page volume on the resurrection. See, pagans disavowed resurrection because they believed they would become a disembodied spirit after death. Jews held a couple of views. There were the Sadducees, who didn't believe in life after death. Rather, they held that when you died, that was it. No heaven. So they were sad, you see. Most Jews held that resurrection meant that the body that died was buried and is the same body that will be raised and transformed into an immortal body. Now, of course, if it's being claimed that the body that had died had also been raised, this implies belief in an empty tomb. Without a body, you might have said that Jesus was still alive as he claimed Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were still alive, but you wouldn't have said resurrection. And as we will see in a moment, that is precisely what the first Christians were proclaiming. So we see that there's good evidence for the empty tomb. The Jerusalem factor, it's witnessed by Jesus' enemies, and the concept of resurrection implies an empty tomb. The Jewish scholar Geza Vermesh writes, when every argument has been considered and weighed, the only conclusion acceptable to the historian must be that the women who set out to pay their last respects to Jesus found to their consternation not a body, but an empty tomb. So here's where we are. We've established not only that Jesus died, but that his tomb was empty. But wait, there's more. Fact number 3, something occurred that convinced a number of people, both friend and foe, that Jesus had been resurrected and had appeared to him. Nearly 100% again of all scholars who have studied the subject acknowledge this. Who were these people? I'd like to consider 2 categories, Jesus' friends and foes. First, Jesus' friends, his disciples. At least 2 people who knew the disciples, Paul and Clement of Rome, reported they were claiming Jesus had been resurrected and had appeared to them. Scholars have also identified what they call kerygma, from the Greek word kerugma, which means an official or formal proclamation. Thus, kerygma refers to the official and formal proclamation of the disciples, or the first Christians. Kerygma is found in early traditions that predate the New Testament. Let me provide one of the main examples. That's found in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 7, that reads, Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 at one time, most of whom are still alive, but some have died. After that, he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. And then Paul adds that he appeared to him too. Most scholars date this creed to within only a few years of Jesus' crucifixion and hold that it originated with the disciples. In fact, most hold that this list of appearances, with the exception of Paul, is the formal list that was proclaimed publicly by the disciples. I wish I had time to explain how scholars arrive at these conclusions because it's very interesting. I have to move on, but if Richard would like to question the conclusions of scholars on these points, I'd be happy to discuss it in the periods that follow. So we have the uniform testimonies of eyewitnesses and the earliest traditions that Jesus' disciples were claiming that he had been raised. But we can go further. At least 7 sources in antiquity attest to their willingness to suffer and even die for this conviction. Now, of course, this doesn't prove their convictions were true, since people of other faiths are likewise willing to die for their convictions. However, it does indicate that they sincerely regarded their beliefs as being true. Liars make poor martyrs. So the original disciples not only claimed that the risen Jesus had appeared to them, they really believed it. The second category is Jesus' foes. It's very interesting that it wasn't just Jesus' followers who believed that he appeared to him, but also an enemy, Paul. Paul was a persecutor of the church or of Christians. He arrested them, beat them, had them executed for being Christians. Then he became one because he believed the risen Jesus had appeared to him. What evidence do we have for this? Well, Paul himself testifies to it. Luke confirms it. And we also have a very early oral tradition that predates the New Testament and says, "He who persecuted the church now proclaims the faith he once sought to destroy." So we have early eyewitness and multiple testimonies to this fact. Folks, this is the type of evidence historians drool over. Paul's sufferings and martyrdom on behalf of the Gospels are reported by at least 7 sources attesting to the sincerity of his belief to have seen the risen Jesus. In addition to Paul, we might add that the skeptic James, the brother of Jesus, converted to Christianity shortly after Jesus' crucifixion because he too believed that the risen Jesus had appeared to him. Most scholars note the embarrassing testimony of the Gospels is that Jesus' brothers, including James, were unbelievers during his ministry. So it's quite interesting when a number of sources identify him later as a leader in the Jerusalem church. Moreover, in spite of Jesus being dead, James' new belief that his brother was the Messiah was so strong that he died as a martyr for it. It seems the best explanation for this change is found in the early creed in 1 Corinthians, mentioned a few moments ago, that states, "After that, he appeared to James." So we've seen that Jesus' resurrection was believed by his disciples and at least one, if not 2, of his foes. The critical scholar Paula Fredrickson of Boston University comments, "I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. That's what they say, and then all the historic evidence we have afterwards attests to their conviction that that's what they saw." I'm not saying that they did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw. But I do know that as a historian, that they must have seen something. Now let's build a case for Jesus' resurrection. I provided 3 major historical facts that are strongly evidenced and are widely accepted by scholars: Jesus' death by crucifixion, the empty tomb, and the beliefs of a number of people, both friend and foe, that he had been resurrected and had appeared to them. In historical investigation, it's very rare that something can be conducted with absolute or 100% certainty. Because of this, the historian looks for high probability, the best explanation of the facts. So what about Jesus' resurrection? Certainly it explains all of the facts and does so easily and without strain. But can any natural explanation account for them just as well? Can I explain these using other hypotheses given what we know from science, history, philosophy, and psychology? In my judgment, the answer is no. It's not just that these hypotheses cannot account for all of the facts. Most of the time, it's the facts themselves that serve as refutations of them. For example, if it's proposed that the disciples stole the body and lied about the appearances, this wouldn't account for the conversions of the church persecutor Paul or the skeptic James, who would have been the first to suspect fraud. Thus, when it comes to Jesus' resurrection, naturalistic theories do 3 things: fail, fail, and fail. But what about the fact that we're talking about a miracle? Is historical investigation possible when a miracle is involved? In my opinion, yes. Historical events never stand as islands. All occur within a context, and the context in which these 3 facts occurred was charged with religious significance. At minimum, scholars have established that Jesus believed he had a uniquely intimate relationship with God, that he was God's chosen servant to usher in his kingdom, that he performed deeds that many interpreted as miracles, and that he predicted his violent death and vindication of God. It is within this environment that the evidence for Jesus' resurrection occurs, and thereby greatly increases the probability of the event being a miracle rather than a result of natural causes. This is especially strengthened when we consider that natural explanations are extremely improbable and unimpressive when trying to account for the known data. In conclusion, We've seen that there's good evidence for Jesus' resurrection. Moreover, Jesus' resurrection explains all of the facts without any strain. Since positive evidence exists for Jesus' resurrection, in the absence of a more likely theory, we can conclude with confidence that Jesus' resurrection was an event that occurred in history. Thank you.
Dr. William Lane Craig is married with 2 children and currently is a research professor in philosophy at Talbot School of Theology, Biola University in La Mirada, California. Dr. Craig earned a doctorate in philosophy at the University of Birmingham and a doctorate in theology at the University of Munich. He has authored, co-authored, and edited over 30 books and over 100 articles in professional journals. He is a frequent public speaker and debater on university campuses. If you're interested in more of his work, he also has a website, www.reasonablefaith.org, with a large number of lectures, articles, and other resources available.
Good evening, and to our Arabic speakers, I say Salamu alaikum. Jesus of Nazareth is the most influential person who ever lived. 20th centuries after his death, he continues to exert his power of fascination over the minds of men and women. But who is Jesus really? I believe that the key to answering that question lies in the purported fact of his resurrection. If Jesus really did rise from the dead, then he must have been who he claimed to be. And therefore, we've come together tonight to discuss the question, did Jesus of Nazareth rise from the dead? Now, it's important for you to understand that in our discussion, I'm not going to treat the New Testament as an inspired and therefore inerrant book, but simply as a collection of ordinary Greek documents coming down out of the 1st century. I'm not interested, therefore, in discussing the inerrancy of the Gospels. Rather, we're interested in determining what facts they credibly establish concerning Jesus' fate and what is the best explanation of those facts. Accordingly, in tonight's debate, I'm going to defend 2 basic contentions. 1, the New Testament documents establish 5 facts concerning Jesus: his crucifixion, his burial in a tomb, the discovery that his tomb was empty, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. And 2, the best explanation of these facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead. So let's look at that first contention together. I'm going to share with you 5 facts about the historical Jesus which are accepted by the majority of New Testament historians today. Fact number 1. Fact number 1 then was that Jesus was tried and executed by crucifixion. According to the Gospels, Jesus was condemned by the Jewish high court on the charge of blasphemy and then delivered over to the Romans for execution for treason for claiming to be king of the Jews. Not only are these facts multiply attested by independent biblical sources like Paul and the Acts of the Apostles, but they are also confirmed by extra-biblical sources from the Jewish historian Josephus and the Syrian writer Marabar Serapion. We learn that Jewish leaders made a formal accusation against Jesus and participated in the events leading up to his crucifixion. From the Babylonian Talmud, we learn that Jewish involvement in the trial was explained as a proper undertaking against a heretic. And from Josephus and the Roman historian Tacitus, we learn that Jesus was crucified by Roman authority under the sentence of Pontius Pilate. According to Luke Johnson, a New Testament historian at Emory University, the support for the mode of his death, its agents, and perhaps its co-agents, is overwhelming. Jesus faced a trial before his death, was condemned, and executed by crucifixion. Perhaps the single most egregious error found historically in the Quran is its claim that Jesus was not in fact crucified, Surah 4:157. Not only is there not a single shred of evidence for this remarkable hypothesis, but the evidence supporting Jesus' crucifixion is, as Johnson says, overwhelming. no historian believes that Jesus was not crucified. The crucifixion of Jesus is recognized even by the most radical critics as, to quote Robert Funk, one indisputable fact. Indeed, Paula Fredrickson, a skeptical critic, declares flatly the crucifixion is the strongest single fact we have about Jesus. Fact number 2, after his crucifixion, Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. This fact is highly significant because it means that the location of Jesus' tomb was known. New Testament historians have established the fact of Jesus' honorable burial on the basis of evidence such as the following. 1, Jesus' burial is attested in the very old information handed on by Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians. In the 15th chapter, Paul writes, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. This old information handed on by Paul has been dated to within 5 years of Jesus' crucifixion. The second clause in the formula refers to Jesus' burial. Comparison of this 4-line formula to the gospel narratives on the one hand and to the sermons in the Acts of the Apostles on the other hand reveals that the second clause is a summary in outline form of the story of Jesus' burial by Joseph in a tomb. Number 2, the burial story is part of very old source material used by Mark in writing his gospel. Since Mark is the earliest of the Gospels, his source material goes back even closer to the events of Jesus' life. And thus we have very early, independent attestation of the burial in both Mark and Paul. 3, as a member of the Jewish high court that condemned Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea is unlikely to be a Christian invention. There was an understandable hostility in the early church toward the Jewish leaders who, in Christian eyes, had engineered a judicial murder of Jesus. Thus, according to the late New Testament scholar Raymond Brown, Jesus' burial by Joseph is very probable since a Christian fictional creation of a Jewish Sanhedrist who does what is right by Jesus is almost inexplicable. 4, the burial story lacks any signs of legendary development. Dale Allison, an eminent historical Jesus scholar, observes, Mark's story of Jesus' burial by Joseph contains neither fantastic elements nor Christian motifs, and so creates no impression of being a legend. 5, no other competing burial story exists. If the story of Jesus' burial were a legendary fiction which arose much later than the original event, then it's strange that we have no traces at all of the real account or even competing legendary stories. The unanimity of the burial traditions speaks in favor of the reliability of the gospel account. For these and other reasons, the majority of New Testament critics concur that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. According to the late John A.T. Robinson of Cambridge University, the burial of Jesus in the tomb is one of the earliest and best attested facts about Jesus. Fact number 3, on the Sunday after the crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. Among the reasons which have led most scholars to this conclusion are the following. 1, the old information transmitted by Paul implies the empty tomb. The expression, he was raised, following the expression, he was buried, implies an empty tomb. A first-century Jew could not have thought otherwise. The reference is being made here to Jesus' empty tomb is again evident by comparing this 4-line formula with the gospel narratives and with the book of Acts. The third line is a summary of the empty tomb narrative. Thus, in Paul's information, we have extremely early evidence of the fact of the empty tomb. 2, the empty tomb story is also part of Mark's very old source material. Mark's source did not end with Jesus' burial, but with the empty tomb narrative, which is tied to the burial account verbally and grammatically. And thus we have, again, very early, independent attestation of the fact of the empty tomb. Number 3, the story is simple and lacks signs of legendary embellishment. In Mark's account, the women come to the tomb early Sunday morning and find the stone rolled away and the tomb empty. They see an angelic figure who proclaims to them that Jesus is risen and will appear to them in Galilee. They then flee from the tomb in terror and silence. Now, to appreciate the simplicity of this account, you have only to compare it to the accounts in the forged apocryphal Gospels of the 2nd century and beyond. They are colored by all sorts of apologetical and theological motifs which are conspicuously missing from the account in the book of Mark. At the very most, the critical historian would only want to excise from Mark's account the angelic figure as an embellishment, and what then remains is stark in its simplicity. 4, the tomb was discovered empty by women. In Jewish society, the testimony of women was regarded as untrustworthy. Now, in light of this fact, how remarkable it is that it is women who are the discoverers of Jesus' empty tomb. Any later legendary account would certainly have made male disciples, like Peter or John, discover the empty tomb. The fact that it is women rather than men who are the chief witnesses to the fact of the empty tomb is best explained by the fact that they were the discoverers of the empty tomb, and the gospel writers faithfully record what for them was an awkward and embarrassing fact. 5, the earliest Jewish response presupposes the empty tomb. In Matthew's gospel, we find the earliest Jewish response to the disciples' proclamation of the resurrection. What were Jews saying in response to the disciples' proclamation, "He is risen from the dead"? That these men were full of new wine? That Jesus' body still lay in the tomb there in the hillside? No. They said the disciples came and stole away his body. Now think about that for a minute. The disciples came and stole away his body. The earliest Jewish response to the proclamation of the resurrection was itself an attempt to explain why the body was missing. And thus we have evidence for the empty tomb from the very opponents of the early Christian movement itself. I could go on, but I think enough has been said to indicate why, in the words of Jakob Kramer, an Austrian specialist, by far most exegetes hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements concerning the empty tomb. Fact number 4. On multiple occasions and under various circumstances, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death. This is a fact which is universally acknowledged among New Testament scholars for the following reasons. 1, the list of eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection appearances, which is quoted by Paul, guarantees that such appearances occurred. The old formula quoted by Paul goes on to say, "Then he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me." Given the early date of this information as well as Paul's personal acquaintance with the people involved, such appearances cannot be dismissed as legendary, but must refer to actual events. Secondly, the appearance narratives in the Gospels provide multiple independent attestation of the appearances. For example, the appearance to Peter is attested by Luke and Paul. The appearance to the 12 is attested by Luke, John, and Paul. The appearance to the women is attested by Matthew and John. And appearances in Galilee are attested by Mark, Matthew, and John. The appearance narrative spans such a breadth of independent sources that it cannot be reasonably denied that the earliest disciples did have such experiences. Even the skeptical New Testament critic Gert Ludemann therefore concludes, and I quote, "It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ." Finally, fact number 5. The original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead despite every predisposition to the contrary. Think of the situation the disciples faced following Jesus' crucifixion. Number one, their leader was dead, and Jewish messianic expectations had no idea of a Messiah who, instead of triumphing over Israel's enemies, would be shamefully executed by them as a criminal. As Shabir Ali himself has put it, for a Jew, the idea of a crucified Messiah is as inconceivable as a married bachelor. 2, according to Old Testament law, Jesus' crucifixion exposed him as a heretic, a man literally accursed by God. According to the law of Moses, anyone who is hanged on a tree as a criminal is under God's curse. The Jews also applied this law to anyone who was crucified as Jesus was. And 3, Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead to glory and immortality before the general resurrection at the end of the world. Nevertheless, the original disciples suddenly came to believe so strongly that God had raised Jesus from the dead that they were willing to go to their deaths for the truth of that belief. Luke Johnson states, "Some sort of powerful, transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement earliest Christianity was." And N.T. Wright, an eminent British scholar, concludes, "That is why, as an historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him." In summary, then, there are 5 facts which are agreed upon today by the majority of scholars who have written on the subject: Jesus' trial and crucifixion, his burial by Joseph of Arimathea, the discovery of his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. And thus the majority of scholars would agree with my first contention this evening. But that leads to my second basic contention, that the best explanation of these facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead. In his book, Justifying Historical Descriptions, historian C.B. McCullough lists 6 tests which historians use in determining what is the best explanation for given historical facts. The hypothesis, God raised Jesus from the dead, passes all 6 of these tests. Number 1, it has great explanatory scope. It explains why the tomb was found empty, why the disciples saw post-mortem appearances of Jesus, and why the Christian faith came into being. Number 2, it has great explanatory power. It explains why the body of Jesus was gone, why people repeatedly saw Jesus alive, despite his earlier public execution, and so forth. 3, it is plausible. Given the historical context of Jesus' own unparalleled life and claims, the resurrection serves as divine vindication of those claims. 4, it is not ad hoc or contrived. It requires only one additional hypothesis, that God exists. And even that needn't be an additional hypothesis if you already believe in God's existence, as Shabir and I do. 5, it is in accord with accepted beliefs. The hypothesis, God raised Jesus from the dead, does not in any way conflict with the accepted belief that people don't rise naturally from the dead. The Christian accepts that belief as wholeheartedly as he accepts the belief that God raised Jesus from the dead. And number 6, it far outstrips any of its rival hypotheses in meeting conditions 1 to 5. Down through history, various alternative explanations of the facts have been offered. For example, the conspiracy theory, the apparent death theory, the hallucination theory, and so forth. Such hypotheses have been almost universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. No naturalistic hypothesis has attracted a great number of scholars. So on this basis, it seems to me that we should conclude that the best explanation of the evidence is the one that the original disciples themselves gave, namely, God raised Jesus from the dead. In fact, all 4 Gospels agree that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified in Jerusalem by Roman authority during the Passover feast, having been arrested and convicted on charges of blasphemy by the Jewish Sanhedrin, and then slandered before the Roman governor Pilate on charges of treason. He died within several hours and was buried Friday afternoon by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb which was sealed with a stone. Certain women followers of Jesus, including Mary Magdalene, mentioned by name, having observed his interment, visited his tomb early on Sunday morning, only to find it empty. Thereafter, Jesus appeared alive from the dead to the disciples, including Peter, who became proclaimers of the message of his resurrection. All 4 of the Gospels attest to all of those facts. If you were to include facts that were mentioned by, say, 3 out of the 4, well, then even more details could be added to the list. But I think it's clear that the core is well attested. In fact, N.T. Wright, an eminent British scholar, in his book on the resurrection, says that the empty tomb and appearances have such a historical probability as to be virtually certain, like the death of Augustus in AD 14 or the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. That is how well established these appearances and the discovery of the empty tomb are. In the Gospels, we have multiple independent sources for these appearances. The appearance to Peter is attested by both Luke and independently by Paul. The appearance to the 12, independently by Luke, John, and Paul. The appearance to women by Matthew and John, and the Galilean appearances by Mark, Matthew, and John. This is one of the surest marks of historicity because you have independent sources narrating the same event, which increases the historical credibility of those events. And finally, I pointed out that the original disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection was something that needs to be explained. Now, what is the best explanation of these? Well, I think it is the one the disciples gave, namely, that God raised Jesus from the dead. My friend Gary Habermas recently did a bibliographical survey of 1,400 articles published in professional journals over the last 25 years on these subjects. What he found was that 75% of scholars writing on the subject agreed with the historicity of the empty tomb, and there was nearly universal agreement on the resurrection appearances to individuals and groups and the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. So I stand squarely within the mainstream of New Testament historical scholarship in affirming these facts.